The window to find earthquake survivors buried under rubble is closing fast in Thailand and Myanmar after Friday's powerful earthquake. Most of the 1,700 fatalities have occurred in Myanmar, with fears the death toll will continue to climb. Patrick Pongsatorn is a senior advocacy specialist at Fortify Rights, and he joins me now from Bangkok. Patrick, good to have you with us today. Now, firstly, before I get to the situation in Myanmar, what was your experience when the quake struck last Friday?
Hi, Girish. Thanks for having me. I was sitting down eating lunch with my daughter, and I felt like I was going to faint. I didn't realize that the whole house was shaking. I thought it was just me inside my body. So I thought, oh, I'm going to faint. But then I didn't, and I realized, oh, it must have been an earthquake. So I grabbed my daughter and we rushed outside, and we just stayed outside until it seemed safe. My neighbors were out there as well, so we were all chatting about it. But thankfully, my neighborhood in Bangkok was minimally affected by the earthquake, but it definitely was very shocking.
Okay, we're glad you are safe. But what are you hearing from your friends and colleagues in Myanmar at the moment?
What we're hearing is a real story of devastation, which is being compounded by a brutal military junta that is seemingly intent on increasing the human suffering inside Myanmar. Obviously, the past years of brutal civil war have not helped in terms of the resilience of the country to withstand an emergency like this. And also now what we're seeing is the politicization of humanitarian aid and ongoing attacks against civilians by military jets and artillery. So it's a really desperate situation for many in Myanmar right now, especially those people right in the epicenter of the earthquakes.
Yes, and we do know that Myanmar's allies in the region, as well as its counterparts in Southeast Asia, China, Russia, India, they're all sending rescue teams there. Do you know if that's being coordinated with other international NGOs and the UN?
I think a lot of that is done on a government-to-government basis, and I don't know how much coordination there is going on. I saw that yesterday there was a meeting, an emergency meeting of ASEAN, the regional bloc, where there was talk about coordination amongst ASEAN nations, with Malaysia, in the lead at the moment on that. But I also saw in their statement that there was a lack of a call for a ceasefire. So without a ceasefire, I don't really understand how humanitarians can really go about doing their job, delivering humanitarian aid. Well, at least it would make it a lot more difficult, a lot more dangerous for them to do that, especially to the areas where the junta isn't in control, which is a large proportion of the country.
Yes, and while that is happening, we've also been hearing reports of strikes as late as yesterday. So the concern is any aid and any sort of assistance even reaching areas that are not under the control of the army?
I think we really need to know more about that, and I think there needs to be reporting, and that's why it's extremely problematic as well that the junta has put restrictions on access to journalists to certain areas where humanitarian aid is supposed to be delivered. From what I'm hearing from my colleagues and partners on the ground is that very little humanitarian aid is being delivered, and what assistance that there is actually very much community-based, and it's just neighbors helping neighbors out, basically.
Yes, and who do you think should be in the ear of the Myanmar General Min Aung Hlaing in telling him, aid and rescue crews do need to get to other areas as well? Who may have that power to be able to change the minds of the junta?
Well, obviously, fingers will point towards China and Russia, who are the biggest backers of this brutal military regime. But I really think at this point, there needs to be a united global voice from the Security Council as well, calling on the Myanmar junta to effect a ceasefire straight away, to allow for the flow of humanitarian aid without restriction, and really to stop their attacks against civilians. I think without that united international community voice, we're not going to see many breakthroughs.
Yes, and are there specific concerns as well for the Rohingya minority, which are persecuted and largely confined to government camps in Rakhine State in fairly poor conditions?
Yes, of course. I mean, there's ongoing humanitarian concerns very serious humanitarian concerns regarding the Rohingya. Thankfully, Rakhine State, where the Rohingya are based, wasn't too badly affected, I believe, by the earthquake. But Fortify Rights has documented in recent weeks the systematic denial of humanitarian aid to Rohingya communities in Rakhine State by the Myanmar junta. And what we've been calling for is a humanitarian corridor between Bangladesh and Rakhine State to allow for the flow of aid and trade, really to save lives. There's a real starvation crisis that's about to hit in Rakhine State, and indeed now probably the entire country.
Yes, and could that crisis be compounded by these incoming cuts to U.S. aid by the Trump administration?
Of course, yes. I mean, that situation is compounded, but this new evolving humanitarian disaster is also compounded by USAID cuts. In previous years, the US would have been in the lead more often than not in a humanitarian response. But now I know they've diverted some funds, but relatively small amounts. And I don't think that they have the personnel on the ground because they've all been fired.
Yes, and finally, Patrick, the junta's chief, General Min Aung Hlaing, he has promised that elections will be held in a period of within 12 months. Will this be postponed?
It definitely should be postponed. I mean, they weren't even ever going to be real elections, neither free nor fair, given the current situation in the country whereby there's an ongoing civil war, whereby there is widespread and systematic persecution of political parties and activists. So those elections were never feasible, but particularly in light of this disaster, they should definitely be called off and postponed indefinitely.
Okay, Patrick Pongsathorn in Bangkok, thanks very much for your time this evening.
Thank you so much.